He tore the divorce papers from the attorney's hands before the ink was dry. That was what Grayson Hale did. Not waited, not hesitated, snatched them, like a man who had been counting down to this moment for months. And maybe he had. He signed his name in 3 fast strokes, shoved the folder back across the mahogany desk, and turned to the woman sitting quietly in the chair beside him, as if she were a piece of furniture he was finally donating. "You can keep the cookware," he said. "Everything else stays." Serena Ashcroft, soon to be no longer Serena Hale, didn't flinch. She had learned not to flinch in front of him years ago. She simply nodded, picked up the small leather suitcase she had already packed before arriving, and walked out of the attorney's office without looking back. In the hallway, his fiancée, Drina Cole, was already waiting. Drina, who wore 3-inch heels to morning appointments and kept her lawyer on speed dial the way other women kept their mothers. She watched Serena pass and said just loudly enough to carry, "There goes the invisible woman. 5 years and she leaves with a suitcase. God, some people have no self-respect." Serena kept walking. She pressed the elevator button. She waited. She stepped inside. And only when the doors closed did she allow herself to exhale, one long, shaking breath that fogged slightly in the cold air, and press her hand flat against the steel wall to keep herself upright. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who should have known better, if you've ever been called invisible by the very person you made whole, stay with me. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because I promise you, what comes after that elevator door closes will change everything you thought you understood about this woman. The morning was gray and cool, the kind of March morning that can't decide whether it wants to be winter or spring, so it settles for being both, raw and bright at the same time, the light too sharp, the air too thin. Serena walked 3 blocks before she sat down on a bench outside a convenience store that smelled of burnt coffee and cigarettes from the previous decade. She set the suitcase between her feet. She put her hands in her coat pockets. She didn't cry. She thought she might, and then she didn't, and that surprised her more than anything. What she felt instead was something closer to quiet terror, the kind that has nothing theatrical about it. Not the terror of someone facing a monster, but of someone who has just stepped off a high ledge voluntarily and is now looking down at the ground, rushing up and thinking, "I chose this. I chose this. I chose this." Because she had. She had chosen this. The ordinary life, the quiet marriage, the anonymity of a woman with no last name that made anyone flinch. She had chosen Grayson's world, boring and status-obsessed and emotionally arid as it was, because the alternative was the only other world she had ever known. And that world came with its own kind of terror, the kind that had teeth. She was 31 years old and had been running from that world since she was 19. She wondered, sitting on that bench with the March cold seeping through her coat, whether 12 years was long enough, whether distance was ever really distance, or whether it was just the illusion you told yourself so you could sleep. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Her sister-in-law, former sister-in-law now, she supposed, had already sent a text that said simply, "Good luck." 2 words, nothing else. Not "I'm sorry," not "he's an idiot," not "call me if you need anything," just "good luck." As if Serena were about to attempt something athletic that might go wrong. She put the phone away without answering. She needed to find an apartment. She had $6,000 in a personal account that Grayson didn't know about. Money she had saved in increments so small they'd never triggered his notice. $20 here, $40 there, over the course of 2 years. A pathetic sum for a woman who had once had access to the kind of wealth that didn't need to be counted because it was simply ambient, like oxygen. She stood up, picked up the suitcase, started walking again. This was her life now. She was going to make it work. Awesome. Grayson Hale did not waste a single morning of grief. By noon on the day of the divorce, he had moved Drina's things from her apartment into the master bedroom of the house that had been his and Serena's, and he stood in the doorway watching her arrange her perfume bottles on the vanity. Serena had left completely bare, because Serena had taken nothing, not even the photograph of herself that had stood on the dresser for 4 years, and felt something he identified as satisfaction. It was 40 years old. He had built something real. Meridian Capital, his private equity firm, was 3 years old and already clearing $60 million annually. He had done that, not with family money. His family had none, But with intelligence and relentless work and the absolute refusal to accept the version of himself that had grown up in a two-bedroom apartment in Queens with a father who smelled like industrial solvent. Serena had never quite understood that. She was supportive, yes, in her quiet, steady way. She cooked, she managed the house. She attended dinners and smiled at the right moments and never embarrassed him. But she never burned for anything. She never wanted in the specific, sharp, almost violent way Grayson wanted. And he needed someone beside him who did. Drina Cole wanted. God, she wanted. She wanted the beach house in Montauk, the table at 11 Madison, the invitation to the Aldermere Group's closed-door summit in Geneva. She said the names of these things out loud and unapologetically, the way other people talked about breathing, and something in Grayson's chest responded to that like a tuning fork. "We should celebrate," Drina said, turning from the vanity with a perfume bottle in her hand, something that smelled like cedar and money. "Dinner at Marcello's tonight, the corner table." "I'll call them," Grayson said. He didn't think about Serena again until 3 days later. When his world started collapsing so quietly, it took him a full 48 hours to realize it was happening. The first sign was Jeffrey Marsh. Jeffrey Marsh was not a warm man. He was a 63-year-old institutional investor who had once told Grayson, over a handshake that Grayson had nearly wept over, that he liked people who did what they said and didn't waste his time. He had committed $12 million to Meridian Capital's next fund 18 months ago, and that commitment was as solid as bedrock. Grayson had built his next 3 years of projections on it. On Thursday morning, 4 days after the divorce, Jeffrey Marsh's assistant called to say that Jeffrey was reassessing his portfolio priorities and would need to revisit previous commitments. The assistant's voice was professionally apologetic in the way that meant nothing personal and all business. Grayson called Jeffrey directly, got voicemail, left a message that he spent 12 minutes carefully composing. Jeffrey did not call back. By Friday, 2 more investors had gone quiet. Not dramatically. No angry calls, no formal withdrawals, just a sudden drop in response time that Grayson recognized the way sailors recognize a change in the weather. Something had shifted in the air. His CFO, Marcus, came to his office at 4:30 that afternoon and stood in the doorway with the particular posture of a man about to say something he doesn't want to say. "The Belford Group wants to push the term sheet meeting," Marcus said. "To when?" Marcus said nothing for a moment. "Indefinitely." Grayson looked at him. "That's not a time, Marcus." "I know." Marcus closed the door behind him when he left. Grayson sat alone at his desk for a long time after that. He turned his phone over in his hands. I was not a superstitious man, but he found himself thinking that this felt specific, like a punishment rather than a coincidence. Markets moved in patterns that looked random but weren't. People moved in patterns that looked random but weren't. Someone, somewhere, had made a call. He told himself he was being paranoid. He was not being paranoid. On Saturday morning, 3 days after the divorce, the city's harbor changed. It happened slowly enough that most people didn't notice at first. The dock authority received a filing, routine or at least formatted to appear routine, for a private vessel's arrival. The berth reserved was the largest available, a deep-water slip that hadn't been used in 4 years, the last time an oligarch had moored his plaything there during a Hamptons gala season. By 11 a.m., the Harbor Patrol had received a separate communication, brief, formal, arriving through channels that made 2 captains look at each other across their desks without speaking, requesting civilian clearance along the southern pier. Not demanding, requesting, in the specific tone that made the distinction meaningless. By noon, there were 12 men standing at the end of Pier 7. Not police, not port authority. They wore dark clothing and the particular stillness of people who are paid specifically to be still. 2 of them had earpieces. All of them were large in the way that wasn't about size exactly, but about the sense they generated in the space around them, a radius of quiet that pushed civilians back without anyone having to say a word. The harbor master, a man named Devlin, who had seen 30 years of boats, walked to the end of the pier at 12:15, looked at the 12 men and walked back to his office to call his supervisor. His supervisor said, "Don't touch anything." At 12:47 it came into view. The Valieri Principessa was 412 feet of black-hulled steel that moved through the harbor water the way a large predator moves through tall grass. Not fast, not slow. with a kind of deliberateness that suggested the concept of hurry had never once applied to it. Its superstructure gleamed, its hull didn't so much absorb light as dismiss it. Along its flanks, almost too subtle to see from shore, a crest was worked into the design, a serpent swallowing its own tail, and inside the circle it formed, a crown, the Valieri Syndicate's emblem. Not on a flag, Sam. That would have been theatrical and stupid, and the Valieri family had survived 4 generations by being neither theatrical nor stupid, just worked into the metal, just there, the way gravity is there. Harbor traffic, which had been operating normally 20 minutes earlier, was no longer operating normally. A water taxi had stopped dead in the water 200 yards away. A tour boat had altered its course without announcement. At the dock, the 12 men had been joined by 8 more, and they had spread in a formation that wasn't aggressive and wasn't passive, and made absolutely clear that the pier was no longer public space. On the promenade above, people had started stopping. Phones were rising. Videos were beginning. At 1:03 p.m., the gangway descended. The man who walked down it was 52 years old and was not, in any conventional sense, physically imposing. He was 6 feet tall, lean rather than muscled, with silver at his temples and a jaw that could have been cut from something harder than bone. He wore a dark jacket and moved the way very few people learn to move, like someone who has never been uncertain where to put his feet. Lorenzo Valieri's face was familiar to anyone who followed the kind of news that didn't appear in newspapers. It circulated in intelligence files, in the darker corners of financial journalism, in the quiet conversations between people whose jobs required them to know which names could rearrange the world without raising their voices. He descended the gangway. His security formed around him and then stopped, because he stopped them with a hand. He crossed the pier alone. His shoes made no sound on the dock planking. Serena had seen him when the yacht appeared. She had been standing at the end of the promenade, drawn there by the same inexplicable pull that had drawn 40 other people, not knowing why, not knowing what she was looking at until the crest on the hull caught the light, and her entire body went cold. She hadn't moved. She should have moved. Every trained instinct she had developed over 12 years of deliberate invisibility said move, now, the other direction. But her legs had stopped accepting those instructions, and she stood there gripping the iron railing of the promenade with both hands, while the gangway came down and Lorenzo Valieri walked toward her. He stopped 3 feet away. He was the only person in the world who had ever looked at Serena Ashcroft and seen exactly what she was. He had been looking at her that way since she was 7 years old and brought to his family's compound in a car that smelled like blood and somebody else's fear. A small girl who didn't cry because she had already run out of tears somewhere on the road. He had given her a blanket. He hadn't tried to explain anything. He looked at her that way now. And then he did something Lorenzo Valieri had never done in the presence of other people. He went down on one knee, on the dock, in front of the cameras, in front of the 40 bystanders, in front of his own security detail, who looked straight ahead and revealed nothing. "Princess," Lorenzo Valieri said. His voice was quiet. It didn't need volume. "It's time to come home." The harbor was absolutely silent. Serena's hands were shaking on the railing. She was aware of the cameras. She was aware of the men on the pier. She was aware distantly of someone somewhere on the promenade saying, "Who is that?" and someone else answering in a whisper she couldn't make out. She looked at Lorenzo, at the gray at his temples that hadn't been there the last time she'd seen him, at the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there either, at the something in his expression beneath the steadiness. Something she had learned to read when she was 8 years old and first began to understand that people who love you can be in pain they won't describe. "You found me," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I always knew where you were," he said. "I only waited because you asked me to." He rose. He extended his hand. And Serena Ashcroft, who had spent 12 years building a quiet life out of careful choices and deliberate anonymity, let go of the railing and took it. 32 miles away, in his corner office at Meridian Capital, Grayson Hale was on his 4th unanswered phone call of the morning when his assistant put a tablet on his desk without comment and pointed at the screen. The video was already viral, shot from someone's phone on the promenade, shaky at the edges but clear enough in the center, the black yacht, the pier, the man on one knee, and Serena, standing there, taking the man's hand and walking with him, not being led, not being carried, walking, deliberately, with her suitcase still in her other hand, down the gangway and aboard that impossible vessel as if she were returning to something that had always belonged to her. The caption on the video read, "Lorenzo Valieri just showed up to collect someone's ex-wife from the harbor. Whoever divorced her might want to reconsider their life choices." Grayson read it 3 times. He set the tablet down. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Jeffrey Marsh. He answered it, but his eyes were still on the tablet, on the frozen frame of the yacht's crest. Serpent, circle, crown, and something cold was moving through him that he couldn't name yet. Something that felt like the first moment you realize the floor under you is not as solid as you believed. "Jeffrey," he said. His voice was completely steady. He had always been good at that. There was a pause on the other end, and then Jeffrey Marsh said, not unkindly, in the tone a man uses when he has decided to be honest because the alternative is worse, "Grayson, do you know who Serena Ashcroft actually is?" The cold thing spread. "She was my wife," Grayson said. Another pause, longer this time. "Yes," Jeffrey said, "she was." The gangway was narrower than Serena remembered. That was the first thought she had stepping aboard the Valieri Principessa, not the sweep of the main deck, not the men stationed at intervals with their hands loose at their sides, not even Lorenzo walking ahead of her with that particular silence that meant he was thinking 3 conversations ahead. She thought about the gangway and how 12 years ago she would have run up it without looking down, and now she counted her steps without meaning to, the way people do when they've spent too long reminding themselves to be careful. A man named Enzo met them at the top. She didn't recognize him. Too young, mid-20s, with the kind of face that was still deciding what it wanted to become. He took her suitcase before she could say anything about it, and she almost reached for it back, because that suitcase was $6,000 and a change of clothes and the sum total of her life at the moment, and some reflex in her that was still the woman who'd had nothing wanted it close. She let him take it. "Your cabin is ready," Lorenzo said. He didn't look back when he said it, just assumed she'd follow, the way he'd always assumed she'd follow, not from arrogance exactly, but from the deeply ingrained belief that when he moved in a direction it was the right direction, and everyone with good sense would arrive at the same conclusion. When she was 16, she'd found that quality infuriating. Now she found it something else, exhausting, maybe. Familiar the way exhausting things get when you've missed them. "I don't need a cabin," she said. "I need to know why you're here now." That made him stop. He turned. Around them, the deck crew moved with practiced discretion, not leaving exactly, but redistributing themselves toward the edges of things, the way people do when they've learned that certain conversations require a different geometry. "Now is when you needed me," Lorenzo said. "I've needed you for 5 years." She kept her voice level. She was very good at keeping her voice level. "You waited until the divorce." Something moved across his face. Not guilt. Lorenzo Valieri didn't do guilt the way ordinary men did. It didn't sit on the surface but went somewhere deeper and expressed itself sideways, in the set of his jaw, in the way his eyes didn't move from hers. "You asked me not to interfere." "I asked you to let me live my life. That's different from abandoning me." "I sent people." "I know you sent people." The words came out harder than she'd planned. "I spotted the first one in 18 days. A man outside the dry cleaner on Mercer Street. After that, I found 3 others over 2 years. I never confronted them because I understood why you sent them, but Lorenzo..." She stopped, breathed, started again at a lower register. "You could have just called." He was quiet for a moment. The harbor was still visible, the promenade where she had stood gripping the railing, now sliding slowly away as the yacht began its gentle, almost imperceptible movement toward open water. "If I had called," he said, "you would have talked me out of coming." She couldn't argue with that. She looked away from him toward the receding shoreline instead, and the city she had lived in for 8 years assembled itself in her peripheral vision and then shrank. And she thought about her apartment on West 22nd that she hadn't renewed the lease on because she'd been thinking about moving somewhere quieter, some smaller city upstate where maybe the quiet could be more complete, less like hiding and more like choosing. That apartment was probably the most honest thing about her life in New York. 2 rooms, white walls, a window that faced a wall. Nothing on the walls. She'd told herself for years it was because she hadn't found the right thing to hang. She understood, watching New York diminish, that the apartment had been honest in a way she hadn't wanted to examine. Come inside, Lorenzo said. His voice had changed, still the same low register, but something had gone out of it, some measure of steadiness that was so habitual on him its absence felt like a sound. There are things I need to tell you while I still can. She looked at him then. Actually looked at him, the way she'd been avoiding since the pier, with the full attention she'd trained herself to withhold around the people she loved, because full attention was how you saw things you couldn't unsee. He was thinner than last year. The gray at his temples she had noticed already, but the gray was also in the skin beneath his eyes, a kind of pallor that had nothing to do with the light. His hands, folded in front of him, were steady, but the tendons were more prominent than she remembered, the knuckles sharper. She felt the cold again, the same cold as on the pier, except this time she recognized it. How long? She said. He didn't ask what she meant. He said, Come inside. What? The main salon was exactly as she remembered, and also completely different, the way all things you leave are different when you return. Same bones, same quality of light through the salt-filmed windows, but reconfigured in small ways that added up to the evidence of time passing without her. New chairs. Different art. The Caravaggio reproduction was gone, replaced by something she didn't recognize, dark and churning, sea and stone. Somewhere between the chair placement and the painting change was 8 years of life she hadn't been present for. His chief of staff, a woman named Petra Vasile, who had been with the family since before Serena arrived, was already in the salon. Petra was 60 and built like someone who had been put together for durability rather than aesthetics, iron gray hair, a face that was not unfriendly but had learned economy. She looked at Serena the way she'd always looked at her, with a particular combination of relief and wariness, the look of someone who cares about you and is also aware of exactly what your presence costs. Serena, Petra said. Petra. Serena sat down across from her without being asked. Someone going to tell me what's actually happening, or are we doing the part where everyone is careful with me first? Petra looked at Lorenzo. Lorenzo sat down, poured water from the carafe on the table, pushed the glass toward Serena and said, 8 months ago we found something in my blood work. A compound, synthetic, slow-acting. Serena took the glass. Did not drink from it. Poison. Yes. From inside. It wasn't a question. Lorenzo's expression confirmed it anyway. The compound requires specific access. There are 11 people alive who know the syndicate's internal pharmaceutical protocols well enough to synthesize it. Of those 11, 4 are outside the family structure and can be eliminated from consideration. The remaining 7 are, he paused, people I've trusted for a long time. What does slow acting mean? 14 to 18 months from initial exposure. He said it the same way he said everything, with the same controlled evenness. But Serena heard the space under the words, the vast, pressurized space of a man who had been living inside that sentence for 8 months. We began treatment 4 months ago. It's not reversing, it's managing. Serena set the glass down. Her hand was steady, which surprised her. You've known for 8 months and you waited until now. The divorce removed your protection, Petra said. She said it gently, but not apologetically. Petra was not an apologetic woman. As long as you were married to Hale, the arrangement was that your identity remained suppressed. The syndicate's internal protocols recognized the marriage as a kind of shield, Serena said. Cover, Petra corrected. Active, maintained cover. The moment the marriage ended, Hale's company lost its protection from our end. But more importantly, your location became, she chose the next word carefully, actionable. Who's making it actionable? The silence that followed was the specific silence of people who are deciding how much truth to pour into a container they're not sure can hold it. There's a group, Lorenzo said. They call themselves the Obsidian Circle. They've been consolidating power in the Eastern networks for 3 years. When they learned about my illness, another pause. Someone told them. Someone inside the syndicate. They believe that whoever controls you controls the inheritance of this family. Serena stared at him. That's insane. I'm not... My will names you, Lorenzo said. It was changed 18 months ago. My captains don't know. My consigliere doesn't know. Petra knows. My attorney knows. And whoever is leaking information from inside this family knew within 30 days of the change. The salon was very quiet. The engines were a vibration more than a sound, something felt in the chest rather than heard. Outside the windows, the harbor had become open water, gray and flat and enormous. "You changed your will," Serena said slowly, "and then someone poisoned you. The timing is not coincidental. And you didn't tell me any of this." "You were living your life," Lorenzo said, and for the first time something cracked slightly in the control of his voice. Not much, just a hairline fracture. But on Lorenzo, that hairline fracture was the equivalent of another man weeping. "You had asked me very specifically not to bring this world to your door. I tried to honor that. Until the divorce made it impossible." "Until the divorce made it impossible," he confirmed. Serena stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to both of them, looking at the water. Her reflection was faint in the glass, a woman in a gray coat she'd worn for 3 years, her hair pulled back in the practical knot she'd worn every day of her marriage. Because Grayson had once said, offhandedly, that he found loose hair distracting at dinner, and she'd never bothered to reverse the habit. She looked at that woman in the glass for a moment. "I want to see the will," she said. "Serena, I want to see it, and I want the medical file. Everything, not the summary, the actual file." She turned around. "And I want a list of the 7 people." Lorenzo and Petra looked at each other. The look was brief and contained and carried a full conversation. "All right," Lorenzo said. The documents arrived within the hour, and Serena read them at the long table in the salon while Petra made calls in the adjacent room, and Lorenzo sat in the chair across from her in a silence that was not uncomfortable. He had always been able to do that, maintain a silence that didn't demand to be filled, and she had always found it both steadying and maddening. The medical file was 63 pages. She read every one. She had grown up around doctors who catered to men who operated outside the law and therefore made their way through medical emergencies without official records, and she understood the vocabulary better than most laypeople. The compound in Lorenzo's blood work was specifically engineered to evade standard toxicology panels. Whoever had made it had access to a very specialized body of knowledge. She put the medical file down and picked up the list of 7 names. She knew 4 of them. The 5th was a name she recognized distantly, a Belgian chemist who had worked with the syndicate on legitimate pharmaceutical holdings in the early days. The 6th was someone she'd never heard of. The 7th was Cassian Moretti. She set the list down very carefully. "Cassian is on the list," Lorenzo said. "Yes. He's been your consigliere for 22 years. 23. "Lorenzo, I know. You've known for 8 months and Cassian is on your list and he's still your consigliere? If I remove him, whoever is leaking information will know I've identified the circle of possibility. Right now, the only advantage I have is that they don't know how much I know." His jaw was set in the way it got when he had already cycled through the argument he was making 10 times before presenting it. "Cassian is the most effective intelligence source in the syndicate. If he's guilty, keeping him close means I see what he sees. If he's innocent, losing him is," he paused, "catastrophic. And if he's guilty and you keep him close, he finishes the job he started. That," Lorenzo said, "is also a possibility I'm managing." Serena put both palms flat on the table. She looked at him. "You are managing a possibility that you die. I'm managing several of them. This is not—" She stopped, started again. "This is not a resource allocation problem, Lorenzo. This is your life." "My life," he said, quietly and without drama, "is the syndicate. It always has been. I made that choice before you came to us, and I've been living inside it ever since. I'm not asking you to approve of it. I'm asking you to understand that I'm handling it the only way I know how." The silence after that was different from the earlier one. In the adjacent room, Petra's voice rose slightly, not alarmed, but pointed. And then the door opened, and Petra came in with a tablet and her face arranged in the specific professional blankness that meant the news in her hands was bad. "The convoy that was supposed to meet us at the Gibraltar Passage," she said. She put the tablet on the table. "We lost contact 40 minutes ago, all 4 vessels." Lorenzo stood up. He moved toward the tablet in a way that looked casual but covered the distance fast. Serena looked at the screen, a maritime tracking map, 4 blinking transponders that had gone dark nearly simultaneously. "Ambush," Serena said. "Likely." Lorenzo was already moving toward the door. "Stay here." Absolutely not. He turned. His expression said he didn't have time for this. Her expression said that was not her problem. 4 seconds passed. Stay behind Enzo, he said, and moved. The operations room was 2 levels below the salon, and by the time they reached it, the room was already inhabited by 7 people doing 7 things at high speed, with the particular controlled urgency of people who have trained for emergencies and are now in one. Screens covered one wall. A man named Dario, who was the Principessa's head of security, was on comms in a rapid Italian that Serena followed well enough to track the picture. The convoy had been hit 4 miles west of the passage. 3 vessels disabled, 1 destroyed, 2 casualties confirmed, more likely. The 4th vessel, the one carrying the syndicate's senior captain for the Western Mediterranean, a man named Faustino Greco, was unaccounted for. Not destroyed. Not disabled. Unaccounted for. Faustino's ship isn't sunk, Serena said. Dario glanced at her, then at Lorenzo. Lorenzo said nothing, which meant answer her. No confirmed debris, Dario said. He made a gesture that was uncomfortable for a security professional to make, a gesture of incompletion. Stopped transmitting and moved. We're tracking a secondary signal now, but it's weak and the heading is wrong for evasion. It's heading toward us. Faustino is sailing toward the Principessa? Serena said. Something is. She felt it before she reasoned it out. The same instinct that had kept her alive and invisible for 12 years. The pattern recognition that operated below the level of thought. If 3 ships were hit and disabled and 1 disappeared without debris, someone took that ship. And if that ship is now moving toward us, they want us to receive it, Lorenzo said. He had reached the same place she had. He looked at Dario. Distance? 40 minutes at current speed. Weapons? Prepped and standing by. Do not engage unless fired upon. Lorenzo's voice was completely level. If Faustino is alive on that ship, I want him alive. If he's not... He stopped, started again. If he's not, I still want what's on it. Serena watched him make those decisions with the same economy of motion she'd watched him make decisions her entire childhood. And for a moment, the 12 years collapsed and she was 14 again, standing in the doorway of his study at 3 a.m. because she couldn't sleep. And he was at his desk with 3 phones and a map, managing some crisis she wasn't cleared to understand. And he'd looked up at her and said, not unkindly, not dismissively, but with the particular honesty he reserved for her, this is what the work looks like. You should know that. She had known it. She had known it and loved him and run from it, and here she was. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A New York number she didn't know. She stepped to the edge of the room and answered. Mrs. Hale. A man's voice, older, something academic in the precision of his consonants. Or perhaps I should say Ms. Ashcroft now. Congratulations on the resolution of your marriage. It must be a relief. Her entire body stilled. Who is this? Someone who has been watching your situation with considerable interest. I want you to know that what is happening to the convoy right now is not a threat to you. It's a demonstration. We needed Lorenzo to understand that his maritime security has been compromised, and the most efficient way to accomplish that was to demonstrate it. You sank those ships. Disabled most of them. Sunk one. Yes, regrettably. The crew was given time to evacuate. We're not savages. A pause. What we are is interested in a conversation, with you specifically, not with Lorenzo. The will is a matter of public knowledge within a smaller circle than Lorenzo imagines, and the terms it contains represent an opportunity that the Obsidian Circle would very much like to discuss with you directly. Serena's hand was steady around the phone. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady too. The particular steadiness of 12 years of practice at being someone who could not afford to visibly react. You called me to negotiate. I called you to make clear that negotiation exists as an option before less pleasant alternatives become necessary. Another pause, brief and weighted. You have approximately 38 minutes before Faustino Greco's ship reaches the Principessa. What's aborted is something Lorenzo will not be prepared for. I'm giving you the opportunity to receive that information in advance so you can make a clear-eyed decision about your next step. What's on the ship? She said. The man on the phone said one name, a name she recognized, a name that made the floor shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the ocean. She lowered the phone. She stood for a moment in the corner of the operations room with the screens throwing blue light across everything and Lorenzo 6 feet away coordinating the response to an ambush and Petra behind him making notations in a leather-bound book that Serena knew from childhood contained things you didn't write anywhere else. And she thought, whoever is in that room right now, at least one of them is the reason Lorenzo is dying. She looked at the 7 faces. She let her eyes move slowly, naturally, like someone thinking about something else. Then Faustino Greco's ship entered visual range. And when the boarding party brought the man they found aboard into the operations room 12 minutes later, not Faustino, not an enemy soldier, but a man in his 60s who should have been in the syndicate's compound in Palermo and instead was sitting here with a bullet graze across his collarbone and the expression of a man who had already decided what he was willing to die for. Serena felt the cold return, not in her hands this time, but somewhere deeper, somewhere central, the cold of understanding arriving ahead of acceptance. The man looked at Lorenzo. He said, breathing hard from blood loss and something else, something that cost him more than blood. It was the consigliere. Every person in the room went very still. General, Lorenzo said. His voice had done something Serena had never heard it do. Look at me. The old man looked at him. His name was Marco Bianchi, and he had served the Valieri family for 31 years. And his eyes, when they met Lorenzo's, were not frightened, only tired. The exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down in front of the wrong door. He has the codes, Marco said. Not just the pharmacy protocols, the transfer codes. He's been moving assets for 8 months, slowly enough to look like normal operations. He coughed. Someone moved toward him with a med kit and he waved them off with one hand. He let them take my ship. He told them I was the one who changed the will. His eyes moved to Serena then, and in them was something she recognized from a long time ago, the look of a man apologizing for something he's not sure apology covers. He told them if they delivered me, it would prove loyalty. He intended for me to die on that ship. Lorenzo was very still. The operations room was very still. The screens on the wall continued their patient tracking. Serena looked at her phone, at the ended call on the screen, at the name of the man she'd spoken to still visible in her recent calls as unknown. She looked at the 7 faces again. She knew now which one. She looked at Lorenzo. He was already looking at her, and in his expression, not in the lines around his eyes or the gray at his temples, but in the quality of his attention, the way it had always been tuned to her specifically. She saw that he already knew too, had perhaps known for longer than he'd admitted, had kept the man close not only as a strategy, but because some part of him had refused to believe it until it was impossible not to. Lorenzo, she said. He looked away from her. He looked at the screens. His hands were very still at his sides. Increase speed, he said to no one in particular, to the room, to the operational machinery of a life built on the management of terrible things. And get Cash and Moretti on the line. The room moved. Screens shifted. Someone picked up a phone. And Serena Ashcroft, who had spent 12 years being the woman who walked away, stood in the center of it all and understood with the absolute clarity that comes only at the moment when all exits have closed that she was not walking away from this. There was nowhere left to walk. Cash and Moretti answered on the second ring. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Not the third ring, not voicemail, not the slight delay of a man reaching for a phone he'd set aside. The second ring, clean and immediate, as if he'd been waiting for the call the way you wait for something you've already rehearsed receiving. Lorenzo. His voice came through the operations room speaker with the warmth of a man who had spent 23 years perfecting warmth as a professional instrument. I've been trying to reach you for an hour. The convoy, tell me you have confirmation on Faustino. Lorenzo stood with both hands flat on the operations table and looked at the speaker. The way you look at something that has been in your house for so long. You stopped seeing it and are now seeing it for the first time with the specific nausea of that recognition. He didn't answer immediately. The room was absolutely still, everyone present understanding without being told that the quality of this silence mattered. Faustino is accounted for, Lorenzo said. His voice gave nothing. It was, Serena thought, one of the most controlled performances she had ever witnessed, and she had grown up watching Lorenzo Valieri manage people who wanted to kill him over dinner. Where are you? Palermo compound. I've been coordinating the response from here. I've got Ricci and 2 of the Eastern captains on standby pending your instruction. What do you need? A pause, brief and calibrated. Lorenzo, talk to me. You sound… I'm fine. Fine. Lorenzo straightened, looked at Dario, who was already running a location trace on the call. There's been a development with Marco Bianchi. I need your read on something. Can you be available in 2 hours? I can be available right now. 2 hours, Lorenzo repeated. I need to manage the convoy situation first. Another pause. This one slightly longer. Of course. Call when you're ready. The line closed. Dario looked up from his screen, shook his head once, which meant the trace confirmed Palermo, which meant nothing, because any competent person routing a call could make it appear to originate from anywhere. Lorenzo turned from the table. He looked at Marco, who was sitting now with a field dressing on his collarbone and the particular stillness of someone managing significant pain through will rather than medication. Tell me exactly what he told you, Lorenzo said. From the beginning, every word. Marco told him. It took 11 minutes. Nobody interrupted. Serena stood at the edge of the room and listened and felt the story settle over everything she thought she knew about the last 8 months, like ash settling after something has burned. Quietly, comprehensively, changing the color of every surface it touched. Cassian Moretti had approached Marco 6 months ago with a proposition framed as concern. Lorenzo was ill, the succession was unclear, the syndicate needed stability. He had presented himself as a man trying to protect the institution, which was, Marco said with a grimace that had nothing to do with his wound, the most Cassian thing imaginable. To dress self-interest as institutional loyalty was the man's only consistent art form. He had asked Marco to provide access to Lorenzo's private correspondence. Not financial, not operational, just personal communications, the kind that revealed what a man was actually thinking rather than what he was officially deciding. Marco had refused, had believed until 3 weeks ago that his refusal had ended the conversation. 3 weeks ago, he had discovered that Cassian had simply gone around him, had found another access point, had been reading Lorenzo's personal correspondence for 5 months. He knew about the will change, Marco said. He knew the day the attorney filed it, maybe before. How? Petra asked. She had her leather book open, but wasn't writing. She asked the question with the focused coldness of someone who needed the mechanism, not the fact. Elena, Marco said. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Serena watched Lorenzo's face, watched the thing that happened in it, not the crack she'd seen earlier, the hairline fracture, but something structural, something load-bearing shifting. Elena Vasari was 28 years old and had worked as Lorenzo's personal secretary for 3 years. She was efficient, discreet, and possessed of a particular talent for anticipating what was needed before it was requested. Lorenzo had trusted her with the kind of access that was only given to people you had decided to trust completely. Elena, Lorenzo said, flat, not a question. Cassian recruited her before she came to you, Marco said. Before. The entire placement was his. I found the financial trail 3 weeks ago. Small transfers, irregular intervals, untraceable on the surface, but if you know what you're looking for… He shifted, winced, steadied himself. I started trying to reach you through secondary channels. Every message I sent, every call I made through the compound standard lines, nothing got through. I didn't understand why until I was on that ship. He was intercepting your communications, Serena said. Marco looked at her. There was something in his expression when he looked at her that Serena had been receiving since childhood from men in this world. A compound of respect and a specific kind of sorrow. The sorrow of people who cared about her and had watched her born into something she hadn't chosen. Yes, he said, everyone. The room processed this in silence. Serena processed what the room was still catching up to. If Cassian had intercepted Marco's communications for 3 weeks, then he knew Marco had found the financial trail, which meant sending Marco's ship into the ambush was not just about delivering a false proof of loyalty to the Obsidian Circle. It was about silencing a man who had started pulling the right threads. She looked at Dario. Who else on this ship has had contact with the Palermo compound in the last 72 hours? Dario's expression shifted, not from incompetence but from the particular discomfort of being asked a question by someone who doesn't yet officially have the authority to ask it, in front of someone who does. He looked at Lorenzo. Answer her, Lorenzo said. Dario answered her. The answer took 4 minutes and involved a secondary screen and a crew manifest, and the particular intimacy of a contained vessel where every communication in and out was technically logged. 3 crew members had made personal calls routing through the compound satellite relay in the last 72 hours. 2 of them had been on the Principessa for over 5 years, and their calls were to family. The third was Enzo, the young man who had taken Serena's suitcase. Serena thought about his face on the gangway, still deciding what it wanted to become, and felt something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but occupied the uncomfortable territory between them. "Where is he now?" she said. "His cabin," Dario said. "He's off rotation until 1400. Bring him here." This time Dario didn't look at Lorenzo. He just moved. Enzo was 24 years old and had been with the syndicate for 18 months, which meant he had been planted there before Lorenzo's will was changed, possibly before Lorenzo's illness was diagnosed, possibly before any of this, which meant whoever had recruited him had been planning the shape of this moment for a very long time. He came into the operations room with the expression of someone who had been rehearsing for a version of this conversation and was now discovering that the actual version was in a different language. Lorenzo didn't speak to him. He stood at the table with his back partly turned, which was deliberate, the studied indifference of a man communicating that you are not worth the energy of his full attention, which was, in the Valieri family's particular vocabulary, more threatening than any direct confrontation. Serena sat across from Enzo at the operations table. She folded her hands. She looked at him without aggression, without theater. She had learned, somewhere in the years of her quiet marriage, that the most effective way to receive information from someone who doesn't want to give it is to make them feel that the information is already known, and you are simply offering them the dignity of confirming it themselves. "You've been with the family 18 months, she said. "Your file says you came through the Naples network. Cassian Moretti vouched for you personally." Enzo's jaw tightened. He said nothing. "The call you made to the Palermo compound relay at 0600 this morning," she continued. "Who were you talking to?" "My mother," he said, too fast. "Your mother lives in Naples. The compound relay doesn't route to Naples residential lines. It routes to internal family communications infrastructure." She watched his face. "Try again." His hands on the table were doing something complicated, not quite still, not quite moving, the hands of someone whose body was attempting to appear calm while running through its options. He was young enough that the effort was visible. "I want to speak to the consigliere," he said. "The consigliere isn't available." "I have rights." "You're aboard a private vessel in international waters," Serena said, not unkindly. "The applicable legal framework is whatever Lorenzo Valieri decides it is. You know that. You knew that when you took the position." She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, like someone having a conversation. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself to me. I'm asking you to consider what happens to people who protect Cassian Moretti after the next 24 hours. Because the protection he's offering you is a temporary structure, Enzo. It was always designed to be." Something moved through the young man's face, the particular movement of a calculation being revised. "He told me it was about stability," Enzo said, finally, quietly, looking at his own hands. "He said Lorenzo was dying, and the succession was going to tear the family apart, and he needed people inside the Principessa who could manage information flow. He made it sound like—" He stopped. "Like loyalty," Serena said. "Like the family needed protecting from itself." She nodded slowly. She had expected something like this. Cassian Moretti had been doing what good manipulators always did, finding the people who wanted to believe they were on the right side and giving them a version of events in which they were. It was efficient. It was also monstrous, but efficiency and monstrousness were not mutually exclusive, as she had learned early. "What did you tell him this morning?" she said. Enzo looked up at her. His eyes were the eyes of someone who has just understood that the bridge they crossed to get here has been removed behind them. That you were aboard. That Marco Bianchi had been brought in. That Marco was talking. The room temperature didn't change. The quality of the air did. Lorenzo turned from the wall. He looked at Enzo for a long moment with an expression Serena couldn't read and didn't try to. Then he said to Dario without inflection, "Secure him." 2 men moved. Enzo went with them without resistance, which was either intelligence or the absence of remaining options. When the room was smaller again, Petra set her leather book on the table and said, "If Cassian knows Marco is talking, he won't wait 2 hours." "I know," Lorenzo said. He has the transfer codes. If he moves the assets before we can lock them. I know. Lorenzo pressed 2 fingers against his temple. The gesture lasted less than 3 seconds, and he would not have made it at all if he had been operating at full strength, and the fact of it made Serena's chest ache in a way she didn't have space for. What's our exposure window on the codes? Petra told him. The window was not comfortable. 40 minutes, perhaps 50, before Cassian could access the transfer infrastructure through channels that wouldn't immediately flag as irregular. After that, he would need to act quickly or the irregularity would become visible, which meant, Serena calculated, that Cassian was right now making the decision between waiting for his scheduled call with Lorenzo and moving immediately. A man who had spent 23 years being patient would probably wait, she thought. He would calculate that patience had served him this long, and that moving too fast now could expose him before he was ready. He would wait for the call. He would perform the conversation. He would buy himself another hour. Unless. The Obsidian Circle contact, she said. Everyone looked at her. He called me. He gave me a 38-minute warning before Faustino's ship arrived, which means he knew the ship's trajectory before I did. He has real-time information from inside this vessel, and the only source for that in the last hour was Enzo. She worked through it. If Cassian knows Enzo has been secured, the patient's calculation changes. He doesn't have a source inside anymore. He can't know what Marco has told us or how much we've locked down. In that situation, waiting becomes more dangerous than moving. Dario was already at his screen. I can monitor the transfer infrastructure for... He won't use the main channels, Serena said. He'll use the Belgian chemist, the man on the list, Hendricks. Hendricks has a parallel financial structure Cassian built for the pharmacy operations. It was never intended for asset transfer, but the architecture can carry it if you reconfigure 3 nodes. She stopped, looked at the faces around her. I read the medical file carefully. The compound in Lorenzo's blood work has a specific isotopic signature that corresponds to a synthesis method developed by Hendricks in 2019. I know that method because Lorenzo's people sent me the file and I spent 4 hours on it. Hendricks is not peripheral. He's been central from the beginning. The silence this time was different from the earlier ones. It had a different texture, not the silence of people processing bad news, but the silence of people recalibrating who they were looking at. Lorenzo was looking at her with an expression she remembered from when she was 15 and had solved a logistics problem at the compound that 3 of his senior people had failed to resolve. He had looked at her then with something she hadn't known how to receive, a combination of pride and grief, the pride of watching someone discover a capability and the grief of knowing what that capability would cost them. He looked at her the same way now. Get Hendricks' network on surveillance, he said to Dario. Everything in and out. Flag any communication originating from Palermo in the next 40 minutes. Dario moved. Lorenzo. This was Petra, standing with her book closed now, which meant what she was about to say was not for the record. Cassian will be at the fortress. I know. The summit is in 60 hours. 21 families. If he moves against us during the summit, he won't. Lorenzo said it with certainty. Serena heard the slight hollowness under the certainty. Not deception, but the particular resolve of a man saying a thing he needs to be true because the alternative is unmanageable. He needs the summit. The circle needs the legitimacy it provides. He'll wait until after the opening ceremony before he moves. That gives us 48 hours, Serena said. 48 hours, Lorenzo confirmed. To do what exactly? To find every person in this family he's turned and remove them from the board before we walk into that room. He looked at her directly. I need you to help me do that, not as my sister, as someone who can walk into that fortress and be seen as the future of this family and make Cassian believe his plan is proceeding exactly as designed. She understood what he was asking. She understood it fully, without softening. He was asking her to be the woman she had spent 12 years not being, to step back into the identity she'd shed like a coat that had gotten too heavy, to wear it in front of 21 criminal families, to perform the role of heir apparent to an empire built on things she had walked away from because she had decided at 19 that the cost of staying was her. She was 31 now. She had tried to build a quiet life and it had not held, and the man who had destroyed it without understanding what he was destroying was sitting in his corner office right now, she imagined, on the phone with Jeffrey Marsh, trying to understand why his world was falling apart in slow motion without a visible cause. She thought about Grayson for exactly 3 seconds. She was surprised to find she felt almost nothing, less than she expected. Not hatred, not love, not even the residual warmth of a long habit, just the clear recognition of a person who had not been able to see her, and the cleaner feeling, surprising in its cleanness, of no longer needing him to. "All right," she said. Lorenzo nodded once. Then Dario said, "We have a flag." Everyone moved to the screen. The flag wasn't from Hendrik's network. It wasn't from the Palermo compound. It was from a private encrypted channel that Dario had broken into with the kind of technical capability that the Principessa's operations room maintained for exactly this kind of situation. A channel registered to a shell company in Malta that cross-referenced through 3 layers of incorporation to a name Serena didn't know. But the message on that channel was addressed to her, not to Lorenzo, not to the Valieri syndicate, to Serena Ashcroft by name, which meant the sender knew her name, her location, and the specific frequency of the channel they'd broken into, which meant the sender was either the man who had called her phone or someone with equivalent access. The message contained 4 words and a file attachment. The 4 words were, "Open this alone first." Lorenzo was already reaching for the screen. Serena put her hand on his arm, and he stopped. Not because she was stronger than him, but because the hand on his arm was hers specifically, and because somewhere in his expression when he turned to look at her was the acknowledgement that this was addressed to her, and she had earned the right to decide what that meant. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. He stepped back. She opened the file. It was a photograph. High resolution, time-stamped 14 months ago, taken in what appeared to be a restaurant, candlelit, intimate, somewhere European from the architectural detail visible in the background. 2 people at a table, leaning close in the way people lean when they don't want to be overheard. One of them was Cassian Moretti. The other was Grayson Hale. Serena stared at the photograph for a very long time. The operations room existed around her. Screens, voices, the perpetual motion of people managing a crisis. And all of it receded to a frequency she couldn't hear anymore. She stood with the photograph on the screen and reconstructed, backwards, everything she thought she had understood about her marriage. Cassian had not simply manipulated Grayson's rise, as the outline suggested. He had not been a distant influence operating through financial levers and coincidence. He had been present. In a restaurant, 14 months ago, across a candlelit table, close enough to be overheard if you were at the adjacent table and paying attention. 14 months ago was 8 months before the divorce. 4 months before Grayson had first raised the subject of the marriage being over. 3 months before he had introduced Drina Cole as a colleague, with the specific casualness of a man testing a lie before committing to it. Cassian had not encouraged the divorce from a distance. He had engineered it from the inside. He had found Grayson, ambitious, status-hungry, emotionally available to a woman who reflected his aspirations back at him, and cultivated him the way you cultivate any useful instrument, with patience, with precision, and with the absolute confidence that the instrument wouldn't understand what it was being used for until the moment it no longer mattered. Grayson had not left her. He had been moved. She felt something then that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but contained elements of both. The specific compound emotion of understanding that something you thought was personal was actually logistical. That you had spent 5 years inside someone's indifference, and that indifference had itself been, in some sense, manufactured. That the man who had called her invisible had been told, by someone else's calculation, that she was insignificant. She had wasted grief on a lie. Her hands were cold. She pressed them flat against the table. Then she opened the second file, because there was a second file which she had not noticed until now. A smaller attachment below the photograph, a single document. It was a transfer order, dated today, signed with Cassian Moretti's digital signature, transferring the entirety of the Valieri Medical Trust, the fund Lorenzo had established to manage the cost of his illness, the fund that paid the specialists, the treatment protocols, the pharmaceutical management that was the only thing between Lorenzo Valieri and the unmanaged progression of the compound in his blood, to a holding company in the Cayman Islands. The transfer was scheduled for execution in 22 minutes, not 40. 22. She turned around. Dario. Her voice came out completely level, which was the only thing she had left to control at this particular moment. 22 minutes. The medical trust. Lock it. Dario stared at her. That would require biometric authorization from Lorenzo or his designated successor, she said. I know, Lorenzo. She turned to him. I need you to designate me, right now. I need the authorization. Lorenzo looked at her face. He did not ask what was in the files. He looked at her face and read it the way he had always been able to read her, and his expression did the thing it had done twice today, the load-bearing shift. But this time there was something else in it. Not just the grief of a man watching something he loves change, but something she didn't immediately recognize. Then she recognized it. It was relief. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has finally found the person he's been waiting to hand it to. He said to Dario, begin the designation process. Sir, the protocol requires a 48-hour override it. There is no override. The protocol is Dario. Lorenzo's voice was quiet and absolute. Find a way. Dario found a way. It took 9 minutes, which left 13. In those 9 minutes, Serena stood beside Lorenzo at the biometric terminal and felt the weight of what was happening settle over her shoulders with the specific heaviness of something that was not a burden exactly, but a responsibility, which was different because burdens are imposed and responsibilities are chosen, and she was choosing this with open eyes and without the cushion of not knowing what she was choosing. When the designation was confirmed, she authorized the medical trust lockdown herself. Her biometric data. Her authorization code, established in the system 30 seconds earlier. Her name now attached to the protection of the man who had given her a blanket when she was 7 years old and hadn't tried to explain anything. The transfer order failed. The timestamp on the failure was 11 minutes before execution. She exhaled. Then her phone rang again. The same unknown number. She looked at it, looked at Lorenzo, answered it. You move faster than I expected, the man said. The academic precision in his voice was the same, but underneath it now was something that had not been there before. A thin filament of something that was not quite anger, but was the register just below it. That's going to create complications. Good, she said. A pause. You understand what happens now. I understand that Cassian Moretti is going to walk into that summit in 60 hours believing he has the advantage, and I'm going to be in that room. She kept her voice very even, very clear. I understand that every person he's turned in this family is now a vulnerability I'm going to map before we arrive. And I understand that whatever you think you are to the Obsidian Circle, you are someone who called me twice today because you needed something from me, which means the leverage here is not entirely his. The silence on the line was longer this time. You're not what he said you were, the man said finally. No, Serena said. I'm not. She ended the call. She set the phone on the table. Around her, the operations room continued its work, and Lorenzo was looking at the screens with the expression of a general accounting for terrain, and Petra was writing in her leather book again. And somewhere in this vessel, Marco Bianchi was being tended by a medic who worked for the family that had just tried to kill him, which was the specific irony of a world where loyalty and betrayal lived at the same address. Serena picked up the photograph from the screen. Grayson and Cassian, candlelit, leaning close. She looked at it for the last time she intended to look at it, and then she closed the file, because she had understood what she needed to understand from it, and she was not a woman who looked at things longer than necessary once she had seen them clearly. She had been the quiet wife. She had been the invisible woman. She had been the person who packed a single suitcase and walked out of an attorney's office and sat on a bench outside a convenience store and told herself this was her life now, and she was going to make it work. She was going to walk into a fortress full of people who wanted to use her or eliminate her, with the dying man at her side and a traitor who had spent 23 years building his position in that room, and she was going to have to be something she had never wanted to be, and she was going to have to be it without flinching, because flinching was how you died in that world, and she had not survived 12 years of exile and a 5-year marriage to a man who had been moved like a piece on someone else's board, only to die in a marble corridor because she hesitated at the critical moment. She had one night before the Principessa reached the Valieri coastal fortress. She had one night and 7 names on a list, and a photograph, and the medical file, and Marco Bianchi's testimony, and 23 years of Cassian Moretti believing she was the soft thing in the room. That last item, she thought, might be the most useful thing she had. She turned to Lorenzo. I need everything you have on the 7 people. Not summaries. Raw files, surveillance records, financial histories, personal relationships, every weakness and every loyalty. I need to know exactly who Cassian owns and how he owns them before we set foot in that building. She paused. And I need to know where my suitcase is. Lorenzo, despite everything, looked almost like he wanted to smile. Your suitcase. I've been in this coat for 6 hours, and I'm going into a meeting with 21 criminal families in 60 hours, she said. I need different clothes. He said to Petra, find your suitcase. Petra found the suitcase. And Serena Ashcroft, who had spent 12 years being the woman who disappeared, sat down at the operations table with 7 files open in front of her, and began, with the methodical focus of someone who had always been better at this than anyone had been allowed to know, to build the architecture of what came next. Outside, the Mediterranean spread itself in every direction, indifferent and enormous, dark water under a sky that was beginning at its eastern edge to show the first gray suggestion of dawn. She did not sleep. The Valieri coastal fortress had stood on its limestone promontory for 230 years, which meant it had outlasted every person who had ever believed they controlled it. Serena thought about that as the tender carried them from the Principessa to the private dock at the fortress's base, the water black and cold beneath them, the fortress above lit from within in a way that made its windows look like eyes. 47 hours had passed since she had sat down at the operations table with 7 files and a dead man's photograph, and the specific insomnia of someone who has chosen to stop running. She had not slept more than 90 minutes in that time, and she felt it in the particular way that exhaustion eventually stops being uncomfortable and becomes simply the medium you exist in, like pressure at depth. She had used those 47 hours well. Of the 7 names on Lorenzo's list, she had eliminated 4 from active suspicion through cross-referencing financial records, communication patterns, and the kind of behavioral tell that surveillance data revealed when you knew what you were looking for. The slight irregularities, the calls made at unusual hours, the financial transfers too small to flag automatically, but too consistent to be coincidence. She had not been gentle about it. She had sat in the operations room with Petra and Dario and worked through the files with the systematic attention of someone who understood that sentimentality about the wrong person would be fatal. 3 names remained after elimination. Cassian, obviously. A captain named Ruiz, who operated the Eastern Mediterranean corridor, and whose financial exposure to the Obsidian Circle went back 26 months, further than Cassian's recruitment timeline, which meant Ruiz had been circled before Cassian found him, which meant Cassian had not turned Ruiz, but had simply located an existing asset and incorporated him. And the third was Elena Vasari, Lorenzo's former personal secretary, who was already in custody in Palermo, and whose interrogation had produced, through channels Serena didn't ask the details of, a confirmation of everything Marco had said, and several things Marco hadn't known. Elena had been 19 when Cassian recruited her. Serena had looked at the girl's photograph for a long time and felt something that wasn't forgiveness but was adjacent to understanding. The understanding of someone who knew what it was to be young and found by the wrong person at the wrong moment, and to have what looked like loyalty offered to you in a package that was actually something else entirely. She had kept that understanding to herself. It wasn't relevant to the operational picture. The tender bumped against the dock. Men moved. Lorenzo stood and extended a hand to help her up, and she took it, not because she needed it, but because they were in public now, in front of the first of 21 families' representatives who were watching from the dock, and what they needed to project with every gesture and every silence and every placement of a hand was continuity. The Valieri family was intact, the succession was clear. Whatever Cassian Moretti believed he had accomplished in the last 8 months was, from the outside, invisible. That was the performance they had rehearsed on the Principessa for 47 hours. Lorenzo had been unsentimental about it, which she respected. He had said, "You will walk into this room as my heir, and you will conduct yourself as someone who has always known this was coming, because the moment any one of those 21 families sees hesitation, Cassian has an opening." She had said she understood. She did understand. Understanding and executing were different physical experiences, and she became aware of the difference as her feet touched the dock stone and the assembled representatives of the most significant criminal families in 3 continents arranged their expressions into the specific blankness of people assessing something they have not decided how to value yet. She was wearing black. She had chosen it deliberately, Not the tactical black of the security detail, but a structured, formal black that said, "I know where I am, and I have dressed accordingly." Her hair was down, which she had not worn down in 5 years, and she was aware of the difference it made in how she carried her face, the way removing something you've hidden behind changes the geometry of your expression. Lorenzo walked beside her. Not ahead. Beside. That was the first signal, and she watched it register in the eyes of the men on the dock. The subtle recalibration, the reassessment. Cassian Moretti was waiting at the top of the stone stairs. He was 61 years old and looked like someone's distinguished grandfather, which was the most dangerous thing about him. Not the intelligence, not the 23 years of accumulated knowledge, not even the network he had built inside the family like a second circulatory system, patient and invisible. The most dangerous thing about Cassian Moretti was that he looked like a man you would trust instinctively, the way you trust a particular quality of light. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with a face full of considered lines, and the specific warmth of a man who had made a lifelong study of making people feel seen. He smiled when he saw Lorenzo. The smile was, as far as Serena could tell, technically perfect. It reached the corners of his eyes and held for the right duration and carried within it the particular texture of relief, a loyal man seeing his leader arrive safely after a difficult transit. He was very good. She had known he was good. 47 hours of his files had told her how good, and she had still not been fully prepared for the physical reality of it, the way competent performance had a presence that you felt rather than analyzed. Lorenzo. He came forward and embraced him, the embrace of old men who have been through things together, and Serena watched Lorenzo receive it with a steadiness that cost him something. She saw where it cost him. In the tendons of his hand when it landed on Cassian's shoulder, a slight excess of tension that lasted half a second. Nobody else would have seen it. She had spent 47 hours watching Lorenzo, and she saw it. Then Cassian turned to her. His eyes were the color of deep water, and they moved over her with an assessment so practiced it looked like warmth. "Serena," he said, "it's been a long time." 10 years, she said. "You look exactly as I remember." "You don't," she said pleasantly. "You look older." Something infinitesimal happened in his expression. Not offense, he was beyond offense. Something more like recalibration. He had expected deference or discomfort, or possibly the wide-eyed performance of a woman stepping back into a world she'd fled, and she had given him none of those things. She had given him an observation, stated simply, as if she were commenting on the weather, and the simplicity of it had landed somewhere in his calculations and required adjustment. Good, she thought, adjust. "The summit convenes in 2 hours," he said, turning back to Lorenzo. "The Eastern delegation arrived this morning. There's a question from the Moreau family about the Gibraltar corridor. They want it addressed before the general session." "I'll speak to them at dinner," Lorenzo said. "And Ruiz?" The name was casual, almost too casual, dropped into the sentence with the smoothness of something practiced. Lorenzo didn't react visibly. Neither did Serena. "What about him?" Lorenzo said. "He's been asking about the succession timeline." "In general terms," Cassian added. "I handled it, but you should know the question is circulating." "Thank you," Lorenzo said. "I'll address it in the opening." They moved up the stairs and into the fortress, and Serena walked at Lorenzo's left and let the stone corridors close around her and breathed the particular smell of the place. Old stone, salt air through the narrow windows, the overlay of whatever the kitchen was doing 3 floors down, and cataloged exits the way she had cataloged them since childhood. The reflex of someone raised to understand that beautiful rooms could become dangerous rooms without announcement. The dinner before the summit was a performance of its own. 26 people around a table built for exactly that number, the geometry of the gathering calibrated to communicate that everyone present was of equivalent standing while also making clear, through the small signals of seating and serving order and who was consulted before the wine was poured, that this was a Valieri table and the Valieri family set the terms. Serena sat to Lorenzo's right. Cassian sat to his left. The physical arrangement was, she understood, its own kind of statement. Not a confrontation, but a container, keeping the two things that could destroy each other at controlled distances. She ate very little. She watched Cassian work the table, the way he moved his attention from person to person, with the efficiency of someone tending a garden he has planted over many years. A word here, a held gaze there, the slight lean towards someone that communicated. I see you specifically, and your concerns are my concerns, and we understand each other in ways others in this room do not. He was doing it in real time, right now, in front of her, and it was, in a purely technical sense, extraordinary to watch. She counted the people he leaned toward. She tracked the duration and direction of each lean. She cross-referenced what she saw against the files she had memorized. 3 of the 26 people at this table were his, not counting Ruiz, who wasn't present yet, whose absence Cassian had noted twice already, with the studied casualness of a man who is not worried about something he is in fact concerned about. After the second course, a man named Pharaoh, the Sicilian representative, one of the 3 she'd identified, excused himself from the table. 2 minutes later, Serena excused herself as well. She moved through this corridor outside the dining room with the purposeful pace of someone who knows where she is going. Every corridor of this fortress for 47 hours in her memory and 8 hours since arriving. She found Pharaoh in an alcove near the eastern staircase on his phone, speaking in a murmur that dried up completely when she came around the corner and stopped 3 feet from him. He stared at her. He was 60, broad, with the kind of face that spent most of its time arranged in an expression of reasonable patience while operating from a position of absolute ruthlessness. She had read his file. She knew 3 things about Pharaoh that Pharaoh believed were known only to Cassian. "Put the phone down," she said. "Ms. Ashcroft." "Serena Valieri," she said. She had not used the name before tonight. She felt it land on him like a change in air pressure. "Put the phone down." He put it down. His hand, setting the phone against the stone, was not quite steady. "You've been managing a shipping route through Pharaoh Logistics that processes Obsidian Circle cargo," she said. Not a question, not an accusation, a fact stated in the same tone you'd use to describe the weather. "The arrangement was brokered 14 months ago through an intermediary in Malta. You moved 11 shipments before the convoy ambush 2 days ago. The 12th shipment was supposed to be Lorenzo's medical records, modified to accelerate his official timeline of incapacitation for the purposes of the succession documentation." She watched his face. "That shipment didn't move because the Malta account was frozen 6 hours ago." Pharaoh said nothing. His breathing had changed. "Here's what's going to happen," Serena said. "You are going to go back to that table, and you are going to conduct yourself normally for the remainder of dinner. During the opening session tomorrow, when I address the assembled families, you are going to be the first person to declare support. Publicly, clearly, without qualification." She paused. "In exchange, the information I have about the Malta account and the 11 shipments goes into a file that will be destroyed if you live up to that agreement, or distributed to every other family at this summit if you don't." The alcove was very quiet. Somewhere above them, the fortress creaked in the way old stone buildings creak. Not weakness, just the acknowledgement of weight over time. "And if I tell Cassian about this conversation," Pharaoh said, "then he'll know I know about the Malta account," she said, "and he'll wonder what else I know. And that uncertainty will make him move faster than he's planned, which will expose him before he's ready." She let that settle. "You can tell him. I'm not afraid of him knowing. I need him to think he has more time than he does. So please, tell him or don't tell him. Either serves me." She turned and walked back to the dining room, and she sat down, and she picked up her fork, and she did not look at the corridor entrance for the 4 minutes it took Pharaoh to return. When he returned, he sat. He did not look at Cassian. Cassian noticed. She saw him notice, the tiny recalibration, the slight additional stillness in his posture that meant he was processing an unexpected variable. She looked at her plate and moved her fork and gave him nothing to read in her face, because she had spent 5 years being invisible, and it turned out that invisibility, like any skill, was transferable. The crisis came at 11:47 p.m., which was the exact kind of hour crises preferred, late enough that the defenses were tired, early enough that there were still hours of dark to exploit. It started with Dario's voice in her earpiece. "Ruiz just arrived. He's not using the main entrance." She was in the corridor outside Lorenzo's private rooms, where she'd been briefing him on the Pharaoh exchange. She pressed the earpiece. "Where?" "Eastern Service entrance. He has 4 men with him. They're not on the guest list." She turned to Lorenzo. "Ruiz is here." Lorenzo was already moving. He moved fast for a man who was managing what he was managing, which told her something about the relationship between will and physiology that she filed away for later. They went down the back stairs, Dario's voice feeding them position updates, and the fortress rearranged itself around them. Not the elegant public spaces where dinner had unfolded, but the older parts, the bones of the place, stone floors and low ceilings, and the smell of centuries. They found Ruiz in the map room, which was as far inside the fortress as you could get from any exterior wall. He was alone. His 4 men had been separated from him somewhere between the service entrance and this room, which Serena understood when she saw the 2 of Dario's people standing outside the map room door. Ruiz was 53 and had the compact, coiled quality of a man who had stayed alive for 30 years in the Eastern Mediterranean corridor through a combination of intelligence and the willingness to do things that other men declined to do. He was standing when they entered, not sitting, which was a choice. Standing was a posture of negotiation rather than surrender. "Lorenzo," he said. "Victor," Lorenzo said. He pulled a chair from the table and sat, which changed the geometry entirely. The seated man was always the one who had decided the conversation's terms. "You came through the service entrance. I didn't want Cassian to know I was here." Serena felt the shift in the room's energy before she processed the words. Lorenzo felt it too. She saw it in how still he became, the stillness of a man choosing very carefully how to receive something. "Explain that," Lorenzo said. Ruiz looked at Serena, then back to Lorenzo. "How much does she know?" "Everything," Lorenzo said. Ruiz nodded slowly, the nod of a man accepting a condition he'd prepared for. 6 weeks ago, Cassian approached me. He told me Lorenzo was dying, which I already knew, more or less, and that the transition plan was being managed by a group that could guarantee stability. He asked me to secure the Eastern Corridor for the transition period. In exchange, my family's operations would receive protection from syndicate interference for 10 years. He paused. I told him I would consider it. "You told him yes," Serena said. Ruiz looked at her. "I told him what he needed to hear." "That's not the same as telling him what I'm telling you now," she said. "Which means you've been running 2 positions simultaneously. You wanted to see who was going to win before you committed." She didn't say it with contempt. It was a rational strategy, the strategy of a man who had survived 30 years in a volatile environment. What changed? "The convoy," Ruiz said. 3 ships hit, 1 taken. 2 of those ships were carrying men I've worked with for 15 years. Cassian told me the convoy would be redirected. He told me no one would be hurt. His jaw was tight. He lied. The map room was cold. The fortress at night retained the temperature of the stone, which was the temperature of the sea below, which was the temperature of everything indifferent. "What do you want?" Lorenzo said. "I want out of the arrangement without my family being destroyed for having been in it," Ruiz said. "And I want Cassian Moretti to answer for the convoy." "Those 2 things," Serena said, "require different things from you." "I know. If you want out clean, you disappear from Cassian's active network and we handle it from here, and your name doesn't appear in whatever comes after." She watched him. "If you want him to answer, specifically, publicly, in front of 21 families, then I need something from you tonight." Ruiz looked at her for a long moment. The look of a man being assessed by someone he didn't expect to be assessed by, adjusting in real time to the discovery that the assessment was more sophisticated than anticipated. "What do you need?" he said. She told him. His expression moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, calculation, something that might have been reluctant respect, and then settled into the specific set of a man who has made a decision and is done revisiting it. "All right," he said. The main hall of the fortress, where the summit's opening session convened the following morning at 9 a.m., was a room that had been designed to communicate permanence. Stone columns, high vaulted ceiling, a dais at the northern end where the Valieri family had conducted the governance of its empire for 4 generations. 21 delegations arranged in a semicircle, 43 people total, not counting security, which lined the walls with the specific quality of furniture that can move very fast. Cassian stood at the dais to conduct the opening. This was traditional. The consigliere opened and then yielded to the family head. He stood there with his silver hair and his extraordinary practiced warmth and began the formal acknowledgments with the smoothness of a man who had done this many times and would, he believed, do it a few more before the transition he had engineered came to its conclusion. Lorenzo was in the front row. Serena was beside him. Cassian had looked at her when they entered. A full 2-second look, measured and contained, that she received with complete stillness and returned with a slight nod, the nod of someone who respects the protocol of the room. She watched something in his expression decide she was still uncertain, still finding her footing, still the woman who had run at 19 and was now being managed back into position. He was good, but he had not had 47 hours of her files. Ruiz was in the third row. He had arrived through the main entrance this morning, on the guest list, correctly. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had not slept, which was true, and like a man who had made a decision, which was also true. Pharaoh was in the second row. He had not looked at Cassian once since dinner. "Before we proceed," Cassian said, reaching the moment in the opening remarks where he was supposed to introduce Lorenzo, "I want to acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances under which this summit convenes. Lorenzo Valieri has faced significant personal challenges in recent months, and the family's strength in navigating those challenges reflects Cassian." Lorenzo's voice from the front row was completely level, not loud, didn't need to be. Cassian paused. The pause was expertly calibrated. Not a flinch, just a beat of acknowledgement. "Lorenzo." "Sit down," Lorenzo said. The room went very still. 43 people simultaneously stopped moving, the way people stop moving when the thing they've been watching as a performance suddenly reveals itself as something else. Cassian's expression moved through several things very fast, and he controlled all of them, which was impressive and also irrelevant, because Serena was already at the dais. She had crossed the room in the 4 seconds of the exchange. She stood at the dais now, in front of 43 people, and looked out at the semicircle of faces, some surprised, some calculating, some doing the specific thing faces do when they are deciding how to arrange themselves in relation to a power shift, and she breathed once through her nose and felt the cold leave her hands, which had been cold since the pier, and be replaced by something that was not warmth exactly, but was the physiological experience of a person who has stopped bracing for impact and started moving. "My name is Serena Valieri," she said, her voice carried without effort in the vaulted space. "I am Lorenzo Valieri's designated successor, confirmed under family protocol 41 hours ago." This designation has been witnessed by Petra Vasili, Marco Bianchi, and the family's legal representative. She paused. Let the room absorb the names, Marco's name specifically, which was the name of a man several people in this room had been told was dead. "I'm going to address something before we proceed with the agenda, because the summit cannot function on a foundation that has been deliberately undermined." Cassian was still at the dais' edge. He hadn't moved toward his seat. He was watching her with the expression of a man running calculations at full speed, his face holding its practiced composure by force of will, that was for the first time visible as force. "Cassian Moretti has served this family for 23 years, she said. In that time, he has been trusted with information, access, and loyalty that represent the deepest form of confidence this family places in its people." She held his eyes when she said the next part. "He used that trust to poison Lorenzo Valieri, to engineer the compromise of our family's medical infrastructure, to orchestrate the deaths of 3 syndicate members in a convoy ambush 48 hours ago, and to broker an arrangement with an external organization called the Obsidian Circle for the transfer of the Valieri succession to outside control." The room was beyond still. It was the stillness of a room that has stopped pretending. Cassian said, "This is Victor Ruiz," Serena said. Ruiz stood, from the third row, in front of everyone, and he began to speak. He spoke for 4 minutes. He spoke with the flatness of a man giving operational testimony, specifics and dates and transaction references. The kind of detail that had the texture of first-hand knowledge, because it was. He named the meeting location, the terms discussed, and the name Cassian had given for his circle contact, the same name Serena had heard on her phone, the academic precision of the man who had called her twice aboard the Principessa. Cassian turned from the dais. He moved toward the side corridor with the specific decisiveness of a man implementing a contingency. He had prepared for exposure. He had prepared for this exact scenario. She was certain. Cassian Moretti had prepared for every scenario. It was the foundation of his method. What he had not prepared for were the four members of Dario's team who stepped out of the corridor he was moving toward. He stopped. He turned. He looked at Serena across the length of the hall with an expression that was, for the first time in 23 years of practiced performance, completely unmanaged. It was the face of a man encountering the exact thing he had convinced himself was not possible. The soft thing in the room, standing at the dais, having burned down every exit while he was still inside. Cassian Moretti, Serena said, and her voice was still level, still clear, and carried the same quality it had always carried in this world. The quality of someone who did not require volume because the content was sufficient. You arranged the assassination of my parents when I was 7 years old. You've spent 23 years inside this family building toward a theft that required the death of the man who gave me a blanket when I had nothing left. She paused. The hall was so silent that the sea outside the fortress walls was audible, the patient, rhythmic indifference of it. I have evidence for every claim made in this room today. I have financial records, communication logs, the testimony of Marco Bianchi, who you tried to kill, the testimony of Victor Ruiz, and the testimony of Elena Vasari, who you recruited when she was 19 years old, because you have always operated on the assumption that people without power can be used and discarded. She looked at him steadily. Every member of this summit will receive a complete file before they leave this building. The documentation is already with our legal representatives in 3 jurisdictions. This is not an accusation. This is a conclusion. Cassian looked at her for a very long moment. Then he said quietly, the warmth entirely gone from his voice, what was underneath it finally audible. You have no idea what you've inherited. I know exactly what I've inherited, she said. That's what you got wrong. 2 of Dario's men reached him. He did not resist. He looked, as they positioned themselves at his sides, like a man who has already moved on to the next calculation. And that was the thing about him, the thing that made him dangerous regardless of what room he was in, the relentless forward motion of a mind that never fully accepted a closed door. She would remember that. A shot came through the eastern window, high, from the roofline, the sharp crack of it arriving a half-second after the impact that took the top of the chair beside Lorenzo and sent stone fragments into the air in a white spray. And the room exploded into motion, 43 people simultaneously doing 43 different things, some dropping, some moving toward exits, security personnel crossing the room in trajectories that overlapped and resolved into defensive clusters around the family heads. Lorenzo was on his feet. Serena moved to him and he was standing, which meant the shot had missed, which meant it was meant to miss or the shooter was adjusting. And then a second shot came, this one through a different window, a different angle, and Lorenzo's left arm snapped back with the impact, and he went down hard against the front row chairs, taking 2 of them with him, and Serena was beside him before she'd decided to move, her hand going to his arm, feeling the heat of the wound, her fingers slick with it. I'm fine, he said, which was the most Lorenzo thing he had ever said. You're shot, she said. I've been shot before. He pressed his right hand against his arm and looked at her with eyes that were clear and focused despite what was in them. Not absence, not shock, but the compressed, furious clarity of a man who has been through enough of these moments to have a relationship with them. Go. I'm not Serena. His voice had the quality it had always had with her, the specific register of the only person who had ever known exactly how to reach her. Go finish it. She looked at him for 1 second. His hand was on her wrist, not holding her, just resting there, the weight of it familiar from 31 years of a particular kind of love, the kind that doesn't require language and doesn't soften with difficulty. She stood up. Dario was already running coordinating communications in her earpiece, 2 shooters on the roofline, eastern and western positions, 1 contained, 1 still active. The hall was chaos managed at the edges by people who had trained for chaos, and through the chaos, Cassian Moretti was no longer where she had last seen him, because of course he wasn't, because the shots had been his contingency, and he had used the 4 seconds of maximum disorder to move, and she had been at Lorenzo's side and not watching the room. She looked at the side corridor, Dario in her ear. He went down. There's a passage under the... I know the passage, she said. She had walked every corridor of this fortress in her memory for 47 hours, and the passage under the eastern staircase that connected to the sea-level access was something she had known since she was 11 years old and had used it twice herself for reasons she didn't need to revisit now. She moved. The corridor was stone and cold, and the sound of the hall fell away behind her as she went down the first set of stairs, and what replaced it was the sound of the sea, louder here, closer, coming up through the ancient drainage channels in the fortress walls, and her own breathing, and the particular silence of a space that a person has just passed through. At the bottom of the secondary staircase, a door stood open that should have been closed. Sea air moved through it, heavy with salt, and on the stone floor just inside the threshold was a smear of dark that she crouched beside and touched with 2 fingers and did not need additional information about. The man who had poisoned Lorenzo and killed her parents and spent 23 years building a betrayal inside the family that had taken her in was bleeding, which meant he was hurt, which meant something between the hall and here had gone wrong for him, and wounded and cornered were the 2 states in which Cassian Moretti would be most dangerous, because a man of his intelligence and preparation, reduced to his last options, would burn everything he had left to keep one move ahead. She straightened. She went through the door. The sea-level platform was narrow and wet, and the night above it was enormous, stars cold and indifferent in every direction, and Cassian was at the far end of it with his hand pressed to his side, and a gun she had not known he was carrying pointed at the space she was stepping into, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has 1 card left and intends to play it. "Stop there," he said. She stopped. The sea below the platform moved, and the sound of it was the sound of every unmanageable thing, constant, patient, without interest in the outcome of any particular human decision. "You've been thorough," Cassian said. His breathing was not right. The wound in his side was doing work on him. She could see it in the way he held himself, compensating, the slight asymmetry of a man managing pain while maintaining threat. "I underestimated the speed. Not the capability. I always knew you had the capability." He said it without bitterness, almost admiringly, the way a craftsman might acknowledge a competitor's technique. "I underestimated how much you wanted this." "I didn't want this," she said. "You're here." "That's not the same thing." He looked at her steadily. The gun didn't waver, which told her the wound was in his left side and the right hand was unaffected. "I knew your parents," he said, "before. I want you to know that I didn't do it without—" "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Whatever you're about to say about my parents," she said, "keep it." Her voice was very quiet and very clear, and the sea was very loud beneath them. "You don't get to explain them to me. You don't get the moment where I understand why. That moment isn't available." His jaw tightened. For an instant, something moved through his face that was almost human. Not remorse, she didn't believe in his remorse, but the specific loneliness of a man who has operated so long in the register of pure strategy that the human responses have atrophied, and who finds, at the last moment, that he misses them. He raised the gun slightly, and the shot that came was not from his gun and not from hers, but from the upper axis above the platform, a controlled, precise shot that took the weapon out of his hand and left him staring at his empty palm with an expression of pure, unfiltered shock. And then a second sound, movement behind her, and she turned her head just enough to see, without moving from her position, the man she least expected. Grayson Hale was at the top of the sea-level access stairs, with a weapon she was fairly certain he didn't know how to use properly still raised, and his face was the face of a man who has driven through the night and climbed the exterior access of a coastal fortress and done something he will spend the rest of his life trying to understand why he did. And the shot had been lucky, she was fairly certain, but it had been his. Cassian, disarmed and bleeding and with his 1 card gone, looked between her and the man on the stairs, and then back at her and said nothing, because there was nothing left that served a purpose. Below them the sea moved, enormous and indifferent, and above them the stars were very cold, and in the silence between the last shot and whatever came next, Serena Valieri stood on a wet platform above the Mediterranean with the wind in her face and felt, with total clarity, that she was exactly where every choice she had ever made had been leading. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. That was how long it took for the situation on the sea-level platform to resolve from crisis into something that could be managed. 3 seconds of wind and wave sound, and Cassian Moretti staring at his empty hand, and Grayson Hale at the top of the stairs still holding the weapon with both arms extended, the way people hold weapons when they have learned to shoot from films rather than practice. 3 seconds in which Serena stood at the center of it all and let her breathing slow, and her hands come down from the defensive position she hadn't consciously taken, and looked at the two men on either side of her with the particular clarity of someone who has just survived a thing and is now processing what survival means. Dario's people came through the upper access behind Grayson before the 3 seconds were finished. 2 of them. They moved past him with the practiced efficiency of people for whom this kind of situation was operational rather than extraordinary, and they reached Cassian, and Cassian let them, which was the final and most complete expression of his intelligence. Knowing when the calculation was finished, when the remaining moves led nowhere that justified the cost of making them. He looked at Serena once more as they took hold of him. His face was gray with blood loss and the specific pallor of a man whose body is beginning to present its invoice, but his eyes were still entirely present, still running, still the eyes of a mind that had not decided to stop. "You'll find it harder than you think," he said. "Not the enemies, the weight of it." She looked at him without expression. "I've been carrying weight since I was 7, she said. "I know what it feels like." They took him up the stairs. His feet found the steps with the careful dignity of a man refusing to be carried even when carrying himself was difficult. She watched him go, and when he was gone, she turned and looked at Grayson Hale. He had lowered the weapon. He was standing at the top of the stairs in a suit that had started the day as something expensive and was now creased and salt damp and had a tear at the left knee from whatever he'd climbed to get here. He was breathing hard. He looked like a man who had done something in the last several hours that significantly exceeded his own expectations of himself, and who was not entirely sure how he felt about that yet. He looked at her the way people look at things they have lost and found, and are not sure they have the right to reach toward. "Your arm," he said. His voice came out rough, stripped of the gloss he usually kept on it. She looked at her left forearm. At some point in the movement through the corridor, she had caught the edge of something. Stone or door frame, she hadn't noticed when, and there was a cut along the outer forearm, shallow, already crusting. She had not felt it. She felt it now. "How did you get here?" she said. He exhaled. "Drove to Nice. Took a boat." He paused. "I found documents." "What documents?" "In my company's records. Files that shouldn't have been there. Cross-references to a man named Moretti, financial structures I didn't set up. Decisions I thought were mine that had—" He stopped. Started again, more carefully, in the manner of someone who has rehearsed an explanation and is discovering that the rehearsed version doesn't quite fit the actual moment. "I found proof that every significant decision in my company for 5 years had a hand behind it that wasn't mine. And the hand led here, to him." He looked at the stairs where Cassian had been taken. "And I found the photograph of me in the restaurant." She was quiet. "I didn't know who he was," Grayson said. "He approached me as a financial consultant. He said he had connections in the Mediterranean shipping sector. He was very good at being exactly what I needed him to be at the exact moment I needed it." He said this without the defensive packaging he would have used 6 days ago. No justifications, no repositioning. Just the flat statement of a man who has looked at something clearly, maybe for the first time. "I was an instrument. I understand that now." "You were," she said. "Serena. Grayson." Her voice was not cold. It was something more final than cold. It was the voice of someone who has moved past the temperature of the relationship entirely. You being an instrument doesn't change what you were when you weren't being used. The indifference was yours. The 5 years were real. Drina was real. What you said in the hallway outside the attorney's office was real. She watched his face receive this, the slight wince at Drina's name, at the hallway. "Cassian found you because you were findable. Because the things he needed from you, the ambition, the status hunger, the willingness to see the woman next to you as decoration, those weren't manufactured. He just used what was already there." The sea moved beneath them and the wind came off it cold, and Grayson Hale stood on the stairs and did not defend himself, which was the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. "I know," he said. "You took a bullet," she said. She had registered this in the operations room, Dario's update, Grayson arriving through the external access, the shot that had come from his position. "Or you fired one. I'm still working out the sequence." "I fired one." He looked at the hand that had held the weapon. "I'm not sure I could do it again. I'm not sure it hit where I intended." "It hit where it needed to." He looked at her. Something moved through his face that was not quite the thing she might have wanted from him 5 years ago. because 5 years ago she had wanted things from him that she no longer needed. But it was human and it was real, and she received it without softening toward it and without hardening against it, which was the most honest response she had. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said. "I want you to know that. I know what I threw away. I'm not stupid enough to think one night on a boat changes the accounting." He paused. "I just needed to know you were all right." She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had called her invisible. At the man who had been moved like a piece on someone else's board and who had not known it, which did not excuse the pieces he had moved himself. At the man who had driven to Nice and taken a boat to a coastal fortress in the middle of the night, because something in him had finally understood what it meant to act rather than position. "I'm all right," she said. "Okay." He nodded, one nod. He looked like he had more and was choosing not to spend it, which was perhaps the most grown thing she had seen him do in 5 years of marriage. He turned and went back up the stairs. She watched him go, and he did not look back, and she did not call after him, and that was the end of Grayson Hale in her story. Not dramatic, not transformative, just a man walking up stone stairs in a ruined suit, choosing for once to leave when leaving was the right thing. Lorenzo was in the medical room on the second floor, which had been set up with the specific thoroughness of a space that expected to be used. His arm was being attended to by a doctor who had been on the Principessa's staff for 7 years and whose expression communicated professional focus over personal alarm. The wound was a through and through. The bullet had passed clean, which meant the damage was muscular and painful and would require time rather than the kind of intervention that needed to be spoken about in low voices. Lorenzo was conscious and sitting upright and arguing quietly with the doctor about whether the level of anesthesia being proposed was necessary, which told Serena he was going to be fine. She came into the room and he looked at her. The full assessment, top to bottom, the reflexive parental check that she had been receiving since she was 7 years old, and that she had stopped registering consciously somewhere in her teens, and that she felt now with a vividness that took her breath for a moment. The way you sometimes feel things more precisely when you've been close enough to their absence to understand what the absence would mean. "Cassian," he said. "Secured. Wound in his left side, non-critical. He'll survive to answer for everything." She sat in the chair beside him. "The summit. Petra is managing the session. We'll need to address the families formally before they leave. Tonight, if possible. The documentation goes to every delegation before anyone boards their transport." "Agreed." He watched her. "Grayson Hale." "Gone," she said. He came through the external access. He fired the shot that disarmed Cassian. Lorenzo processed this in the way he processed unexpected information. Very still, very internal. The processing invisible on the surface, but evident in the slight delay before his next word. He said, which was Lorenzo for "I was not expecting that, and I'm not sure what to do with it." "He's not a problem," she said. "He's not a factor. His company loses whatever Cassian built into it and whatever organic growth it generated. The Obsidian Circle's withdrawal will take 3 or 4 years to fully work through the market exposure. He'll survive it. He's more capable than he knew, which was always the irony." She paused. He just needed to believe it was all himself. When he stopped needing that, there was actually someone there. "Do you feel anything about him?" Lorenzo said. He asked it directly, without softening, because he had always asked her direct questions, and she had always found it both difficult and the thing she trusted most about him. She thought about it, actually thought about it, rather than reaching for the answer that was easy. "Something," she said. "Not love, not hate. Something that's mostly tired. Tired of the shape it had. Tired of who I was inside it." She looked at her hands. "I think I felt invisible for so long I forgot that was something he was doing, not something I was." Lorenzo looked at her for a moment. "You were never invisible," he said. "You were hidden. Those are different things." She did not cry. She was not going to cry in the medical room with the doctor 3 feet away attending to a gunshot wound, which was a reasonable boundary. But something shifted in her chest at those words, something that had been held in a specific position for a long time, and the shift was not comfortable and was also, in the way that necessary things often are, relief. "I need you to tell me something," she said. "Honestly?" "Always." "The will change, the designation, all of it." She met his eyes. "Did you always intend this? Or did the illness make it necessary? He was quiet for a moment. The doctor worked carefully at his arm, and the room was small, and the night outside the window was beginning to show the first gray at its edges. Both, he said finally. I always knew what you were. I watched you from the time you were 7 years old, and I saw someone who understood this world in her bones, whether she wanted to or not. When I got sick, he paused. When I got sick, the necessity gave me permission to do what I had always wanted to do but hadn't, because you had asked me not to. He looked at her steadily. I want you to know that the designation is not only about protecting the Empire. It's about giving you back the choice you never got to make freely. She looked at him. What choice? Whether to be part of this family, he said. You left at 19 because you were afraid of what this life would make of you. You had the right to be afraid. You had seen what it made of people. But you were 19 and afraid, and that decision had the shape of a wound, not a choice. He shifted slightly, winced, ignored the wince with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to his body's objections. You're 31 now. You've seen both sides. You can choose now with your eyes fully open. He paused. The will stands regardless, but I'm asking whether you want this, not whether you'll do it because you're needed. The doctor stepped back to reach for something on the tray beside him, and in the brief space of his attention moving away, Lorenzo put his right hand over hers on the arm of the chair, not holding, not gripping, just present. She looked at his hand over hers, at the knuckles sharper than they'd been, at the age in the skin that hadn't been there 12 years ago. I want this, she said. Not the violence, not the parts that destroyed my family and 100 other families, but the people in it, the ones who stayed loyal, who protected what mattered when they didn't have to. I want to be responsible for those people. She breathed. And I want to dismantle the parts that should be dismantled, not the whole structure. The parts that are only there because no one powerful enough ever decided to remove them. Lorenzo looked at her. That's a harder project than running the Empire as it is, he said. I know. People will resist it. People inside this family will resist it before people outside do. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment, then, I'll help you for as long as I can. I know that also, she said, but Seb. The formal session reconvened at 6 in the morning, which meant the assembled families had been in the fortress for the full night and were tired and shaken and in the specific mood of people who have witnessed something they had not planned to witness and are now recalibrating their understanding of several things simultaneously. Serena stood at the dais with Lorenzo to her left, his arm in a sling, his face composed, his presence doing the specific work that Lorenzo Valieri's presence had always done, the work of communicating. This family is intact. The foundation has held. She spoke for 22 minutes. She did not perform. She did not give them the speech she had drafted in her head on the Principessa, the careful, calibrated address designed to communicate strength through control. She gave them the truth, in the flattest language she could find, because she had learned something in 48 hours that she suspected she had always known but not trusted. The truth, told without ornament, was more authoritative than any performance. She told them what Cassian had done. She told them what she had found. She told them what the Obsidian Circle was, and what it had attempted and what remained of it following the transfer lockdown and the detention of 3 additional Circle members whose identities she had established through the financial cross-referencing on the Principessa. She told them about the convoy. She named the men who had died. She told them that the Valieri family's intention going forward was to honor the alliances that had been built on genuine mutual interest and to formally dissolve the arrangements that had been built on extraction and threat. She told them that the documentation in the folders, now in front of each delegation, contained everything she had just described, verified and notarized, and that each family was entitled to make their own determination about what this meant for their relationship with the Valieri organization. She told them she expected that some of them would withdraw. That was their right. She was not asking for loyalty through fear, which was the only method this family had previously employed, and which had produced the conditions for Cassian's betrayal in the first place, because loyalty through fear produced people who were waiting for the moment fear no longer applied. She paused then. Let the room hold what she'd said. I'm asking, she said, for something harder and less certain. I'm asking you to do business with a family that is trying to change what it is, which I know is a risk and which I am not asking you to accept on trust. I'm asking you to watch what we do and to decide based on that. She looked around the semicircle. Actions take longer than speeches. I understand that. I have no speech that is worth more than what we actually do in the next 12 months. She stepped back from the dais. The silence lasted approximately 7 seconds. Then Pharaoh, from the second row, the man she had cornered in the corridor, the man she had given a choice, stood up and said, in the flat declarative manner of someone who has made a decision and is past revisiting it. The Pharaoh Network extends its support to the Valieri succession. Victor Ruiz, from the third row, stood without being prompted. He said nothing. He sat back down. That was sufficient. 4 more delegations stood before the session formally closed. 3 did not. 2 asked for time, which she granted without condition. It was not a sweep. It was not a coronation. It was 7 delegations out of 21, which was a start, which was in fact more than a start, which was the functional architecture of a coalition if managed correctly over time. She understood the math. She had done the math while she was sitting in the operations room at 3 in the morning reading files. Lorenzo understood it too. She caught his eye after the session, and he gave her a nod that was not the nod of a man satisfied. It was the nod of a man who has learned over 50 years to distinguish between what you wanted and what you got, and to work honestly with the difference. They brought Cassian before her in the afternoon. She had requested this. Not Lorenzo, not Dario, not the assembled captains who would have been the traditional form. She had requested a private meeting, 15 minutes, one of Dario's people present and armed, and they had brought him to the small room off the eastern corridor that smelled of old paper and salt. He was cleaned up and bandaged and handcuffed to the chair with the specific indignity of a man who has spent 23 years being the one who decided where other people sat and is now sitting where someone else decided. He looked at her when she came in with the assessment still running in his eyes, the intelligence that not even a bullet wound and a night in custody had interrupted. She sat across from him. She did not bring documentation. She did not bring a recorder. She brought herself and 15 minutes and the specific question she needed answered. "My parents," she said. "Why?" He looked at her. The warmth was fully gone. She suspected it had always been a thing he wore rather than a thing he was. The warmth. And without it, his face was striking in a different way. The way a building's structure is striking when the ornamental facing has been removed. Not cruel, just functional. The face of a man for whom human beings had always been primarily variables. "Your father was going to expose the Mediterranean corridor," Cassian said. "Not the whole operation. He didn't know the whole operation. But he knew enough to put the Valieri name in front of 3 governments' intelligence services, and that knowledge, combined with his access to Lorenzo's inner circle, made him a liability that couldn't be managed any other way. He said it the way he said everything, without drama, with the flatness of a man describing a business decision. Your mother was collateral. She was there. She received this. She sat with it. She had known some version of this for a long time, had assembled the shape of it from fragments over 20 years. But the actual words, stated plainly by the person who had made the decision, landed differently than the shape had. "You told Lorenzo it was the Bianchi family," she said. "Yes. And he believed you for 23 years. Lorenzo trusted me." He said this without triumph. Not naively. He wasn't a naive man, but I was very careful about what I let him see and what I kept from him, and I had 23 years to calibrate it. Yes, he believed me. She thought about Marco Bianchi, 68 years old, with a bullet graze on his collarbone and the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent a generation being blamed for something he didn't do. She would have to address that. There were things that could not be undone. The deaths, the years, the accumulated weight of a lie maintained by the man everyone trusted. But some things could be addressed formally, in front of the people who needed to hear it, and she would do that. "Was anything in your 23 years genuine?" she said. He thought about it. She had not expected him to think about it. She had expected either a performance of feeling or a flat denial, but he actually sat with the question for a moment, and in that moment he looked more human than he had looked at any other point in the previous 48 hours. "Lorenzo," he said finally, "in the beginning, the first 5 or 6 years, it wasn't only strategy, he stopped, started differently. I was the most capable person I'd ever worked with. And for a time, that was enough. That was genuine." He looked at his handcuffed wrist. Then it became clear that his capability was going to be applied to goals I couldn't reconcile with what I believed the Empire should become. So I built something else around it. He paused. But the first years were real. She stood up. She had 15 minutes and she had used 12, and she had what she needed, which was not absolution for him and not closure for herself, but the information she had come for, placed where she could look at it clearly without it surprising her from a direction she hadn't expected. You'll be transferred to a secure location while the legal process runs, she said. Our attorneys are working with 3 jurisdictions on the criminal exposure for the convoy deaths. That process will be transparent, documented, on record, not managed quietly. Everything about what you did and what the consequences are will be on record. She moved toward the door. You said I don't know what I've inherited. You're right that I'm still learning it, but I know this much. I'm not going to manage it the way you managed it. I'm not going to keep the things that needed to be kept from the light in the dark just because the light is uncomfortable. She put her hand on the door. That's the difference between us. He looked at her. He said, that difference will cost you. Maybe, she said. It will cost me less than your way cost everyone else. She walked out and closed the door and did not look through the small window as she passed it, because she had spent enough time in Cassian Moretti's presence and intended to spend no more than required by the process ahead. Grayson Hale left the fortress at noon in a car that Petra arranged without being asked, which was the kind of thing Petra did, anticipated what was needed before anyone named it. He was given a driver and a route to the Nice airport and nothing else, because nothing else was owed, and she had been clear about that without saying it directly. She watched the car from the eastern window, not because she needed to see it go, but because she was in the eastern corridor on her way to the docks, and it happened to pass below her while she was there. She watched it for the 3 seconds it was visible, and then it was gone around the headland, and she continued to the docks. Marco Bianchi was there. He was sitting on a bench near the water with his jacket off despite the cold, the bandaged shoulder visible, watching the Principessa where it sat at anchor 200 yards out. He looked, in profile, like a man having a conversation with something that wasn't there. She sat down beside him. He didn't seem surprised. He looked at the yacht for another moment and then at her. His face had the quality that faces get when the adrenaline is fully gone and what's left is just the accounting. The sober, unsparing addition of everything that has happened against everything that can't be changed. He believed it, Marco said. About my family. For 23 years he believed it. Yes, she said. I thought about telling him. 100 times. More. He looked at his hands. Every time I came close, I thought, if I tell him now, Cassian will know the investigation has reached me, and I'll lose whatever advantage I have left. I kept waiting for the right moment, and there was never a right moment. He was quiet. There's never a right moment for things like that. You just have to say them. She thought about this. About the things she had waited for the right moment to say in her own life, to Grayson, to Lorenzo, to herself, and about how the waiting had compounded everything, had turned manageable things into structural ones. He knows now, she said. I'm going to make a formal statement to the remaining captains today. Your family's name is cleared in the record. Everything Cassian falsified will be documented and corrected. She paused. It doesn't give you 23 years back. No, Marco said. I know. He looked at the yacht again. She's beautiful, he said. The Principessa. I've been looking at her for 20 years and I still think so. She is. What happens to her? She stays in service. Lorenzo is stepping back from day-to-day operations, but he's not going anywhere. I've been explicit about that. She looked at the yacht herself. The long black hull, the serpent crest catching the afternoon light. The thing it represented, which was both terrible and complex, and hers now in a way she was still learning the dimensions of. I told him I needed him around for the things I don't know yet. He told me there was nothing he could tell me that I couldn't figure out myself. We argued about it for 20 minutes, and I won. Marco made a sound that was almost a laugh. It surprised them both. It was a short sound, rough at the edges, not quite assembled into a full laugh, but recognizable as the raw material for one. And it was the most human sound she had heard in 48 hours. And she felt something ease in her chest at the sound of it. Good, he said. Someone should win arguments with Lorenzo. Someone should have started sooner, she said. They sat there for a few minutes in the companionable silence of people who have been through something together and don't need to manage the quiet. The sea was calmer than it had been. The wind had dropped, and the surface of the water had the particular smoothness of afternoon, Mediterranean calm, gray-green and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the drama that had been conducted on and above it in the last 48 hours. "What do you need from me?" Marco asked. "Going forward." "Your experience," she said. "Your honesty. Your willingness to tell me when I'm wrong before it becomes expensive." She looked at him. "The captains need to see that the people who stayed loyal when it cost something are the people I keep close. Not for symbolism, because they're the people whose judgment I can actually trust." Marco looked at her for a moment with the expression she had seen from him on the ship, the apology for things that couldn't be covered by apology. "I should have found a way to reach you sooner," he said. "When I found the financial trail. I kept trying through the compound channels and they were compromised, but there were other ways. I should have—" "You did what you could with what you had," she said. "That's what I'm asking everyone to do going forward. What you could with what you have, not perfection." He nodded slowly. He looked at the water. "Your parents would have—" he started, stopped. "You don't have to," she said. "I want to." He looked at her directly. "Your father was one of the most principled men I knew in an environment where principle was considered a liability. And your mother—" he paused. "Your mother used to argue with Lorenzo about the direction of the organization. In the early years. She was the only person who did. She was never afraid to say when something was wrong." He looked at her steadily. "I see them in you. Not just your father's intelligence or your mother's courage. The combination of both. The way you walked into that hall this morning." He stopped again. His jaw was working. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect them." She sat with that. With the weight of it and the gift of it. The simultaneous presence of both. The grief and the receiving. The understanding that some things could be held together without either canceling the other. "I know," she said. The afternoon light moved across the water in the way Mediterranean afternoon light moved. Long and gold and unhurried, with the specific quality of a place that has been beautiful for long enough to be indifferent about it. She sat in it for another minute beside Marco Bianchi and let it be what it was. Then she stood up. She had work to do. She would have work to do, she understood, for a very long time. Lorenzo was on the upper deck of the Principessa when she came aboard that evening, sitting in one of the deck chairs with his bandaged arm resting on the armrest and a glass of water. He wasn't drinking on the small table beside him. He was looking at the coastline, the fortress above on its limestone promontory, the town below it scattered with lights coming on one by one as the dusk deepened, the long curve of the coast north and south of it. She sat beside him. She did not bring anything with her. No files, no phone, no tablet, with the 17 ongoing matters that Petra had briefed her on that afternoon. She brought only herself, which was its own kind of discipline after 48 hours of bringing everything. "How's the arm?" she said. "Instructive," he said. "In the sense that it reminds me I'm not 30. You haven't been 30 in 22 years. I was better at pretending." He glanced at her. "The session with the captains went well. Better than I expected. Marco? He'll take the position." She had asked Marco to come on formally as senior advisor, which was a thing she had invented the title for because the existing titles were all historically associated with structures. She was in the process of restructuring and she needed to begin the language differently. Marco had looked at the title for a moment and then said yes. "Good," Lorenzo said. "The 3 families that declined today, I'm going to reach out to each of them personally in the next month. Not to pressure, just to keep the channel open." "That's correct." "The Obsidian Circle's remaining network. Dario has 4 more names. We'll address each through appropriate channels. Not quietly, on the record." "Also correct?" She looked at him. He had the expression of a man who is deliberately not helping, the expression of a teacher watching a student arrive at the answer and choosing not to shorten the journey. "You're not going to tell me what I'm getting wrong," she said. "You're not getting anything wrong so far," he said. "Ask me in a year." She was quiet for a moment. The water moved against the hull in the small, patient rhythm it had maintained throughout everything. The ambush, the fortress, the 48 hours, all of it. Indifferent and continuous. "Cassian said you'd find it harder than I think," she said. "Cassian was right," Lorenzo said. "The weight of it doesn't become lighter. You become better at carrying it. Those are different things, and people confuse them." He shifted in the chair. But you knew that before you chose it. I did. Then you're prepared for the right difficulty. He picked up the water glass and held it without drinking. I'm going to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. All right. Are you staying because you want to, or because there was nothing left to go back to? She thought about the bench outside the convenience store, about the white walls and the window facing the wall, about the $6,000 and the packed suitcase and the 2 words her former sister-in-law had sent, about 12 years of building something quiet that had not been quiet, only compressed, only the pressure of a life held in a smaller shape than it needed. I'm staying, she said, because I came back and found out this was the thing I was capable of, and I'm not interested anymore in arranging my life around a smaller version of what I'm capable of. She paused. And because the people here are mine, not the empire, the people. Marco, Petra, you. She looked at him. The rest I'll build as I go. He was quiet. He looked at the coastline. He breathed in the way she had come to read over the last 2 days. Carefully, deliberately, the breathing of someone who was managing something that the breathing was part of managing, and she let herself understand fully and without flinching what that meant for the timeline they were working with, the urgency underneath all of it that she had been holding at arm's length in order to function. Lorenzo, she said. I know, he said. I need you to actually take the treatment seriously, not the way you've been taking it, which is approximately 50% serious, fully. It's uncomfortable. I don't care. The side effects, I don't care, she said again, more quietly. You told me I could have the argument. I'm having it. Take the treatment. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to deflect. Then, all right, all right, all right, he repeated, with the slight emphasis of a man who has made a genuine concession and is not going to undermine it by discussing it further. She exhaled. The last of the daylight was going. The fortress above them had gone from gold to gray to the dark silhouette of old stone against a darkening sky. And the lights in the town below were fully on now. And on the water around the Principessa, the reflections of those lights made small, moving shapes that had no particular meaning and were beautiful anyway. I never hung anything on the walls, she said. He looked at her. What? In my apartment in New York, 2 years I lived there. I told myself I hadn't found the right thing, but really, she thought about how to say it. I think I knew I was still somewhere temporary. I think I never fully arrived. He looked at the coastline for a moment. And now? She looked at the water, at the lights, at the old stone fortress on its limestone promontory that had stood for 230 years and would stand after everything that had happened inside it this week had become part of the long, unromantic story of what human beings did to each other and for each other in the rooms they built to last. Now I'm here, she said. They sat in the thickening dark as the Mediterranean settled into its nighttime self, vast and quiet, and holding every ship that had ever crossed it without preference or memory, the same water it had been for longer than anyone's story went back. Beside her, Lorenzo breathed his careful, managed breath, and somewhere below decks Petra was closing her leather book for the night, and Marco Bianchi was sitting with the weight of 31 years of service and 1 night of survival, and the strange, specific grace of a man who has been given back his name. And Serena Valieri, who had once been a small girl brought to a stranger's house in a car that smelled like fear, and then a woman who had packed a suitcase and tried to build something ordinary from the materials of a life that had never been ordinary, sat at the bow of her family's vessel with the wind in her face and the sea in every direction, and did not look back at the shore she had left. There was nothing behind her that required her eyes. Everything that mattered was here and ahead and hers.